What's up, grinders? So today we're going to do something that's a little bit more relaxed because it's my birthday, which means we're going to review something which is probably a little bit left field for this channel. That's kind of saying a lot considering that most of my videos recently have been a little bit wacky in some way or another. So we're going to look at this video here, Alan Moore, Language, Writing and Magic. Now, you guys probably don't know this, but I went deep into magic at one point, specifically magical languages, because why not? It's a language-like topic. And I remember I looked at everything to do with the Voynich manuscript. I looked at the actual written script of it. It was fascinating to me. I didn't try to decode it, obviously no one's decoded it, except for tiny little aspects of it. I looked into other magical languages. For example, Satanism has in the back of their Devil's Bible, basically, they have a magical language, which I think is based on key system from Alistair Crowley. I can't remember anyway. But I've gone into pretty much every magical language out there, and I've thought about languages and magic overall and how they would function. But let's watch this video. Hopefully it's not anything too traumatic. But before we start, check out my birthday gift. Booyah! So here I have 500 common Chinese idioms. These are Chengyu. Now, this is not something you will learn in context. You have to study these. So it doesn't matter how much content you absorb, you will need to study these at some point, and I plan to probably over the next 2 years slowly memorize all of those in there. So let's watch this video.
One of the most revealing aspects.
Whoa. I love how he just vanishes into existence. Okay, so straight up looking at this guy, he's not giving me Wiccan vibes, but I'm definitely getting occult vibes.
Of my researches into magic and the occult.
Okay, yeah. This is your stereotypical occultist, someone who likes to research the occult.
Has been the discovery that actually magic has quite a lot in common with fiction.
Okay, first up, I can see why already this video has a lot of views. Let me just check how many views it was again. 318k views. Now, the reason here is you can clearly see from the way that this guy's sitting, he's very relaxed. He's very open, so he's got his legs and his hands open. He's very calm, and then he's speaking very slowly. Now, another thing that I've dived into a lot, because I've done presentations in public, so I've done training regarding this and how to present and keep your audience engaged. One thing that you want to do is talk slow. Now, for you, it's going to sound so slow, but if you talk slow, what it does is it creates in the mind of the other people here that you've really thought over this, and therefore you are an authority figure on this. And the calmness of his voice will also lure you in as well. Now, I don't speak like that in my videos because I prefer to be more of an upbeat type of personality and to keep things kind of, moving up and down as opposed to more monotone. But I just like to point out these things because it is something you can train in.
And with fantasy, we almost get to the notion that the two are pretty well interchangeable. I think that Alistair Crowley even mentioned...
He mentioned the exact guy.
That the language of magic is more about language than it is about magic.
And this has always been a topic that has fascinated me, even back to when I was in high school and I was reading the Harry Potter books. I always imagined, okay, here we get snippets of this magical language, single words basically. But does this language, this magical language, have a grammar? And if it has a grammar, that means you should be able to combine spells. And if it has a grammar of some form with suffixes and stuff like this, that means therefore you should be able to modify these spells. And then a good caster, a good magical caster, is no longer just someone who's memorized a bunch of, canned responses. They're literally someone who's good at a language. So that means if we lived in a fantasy world, you, me, the guys watching this video, we would probably be the Dumbledores of the world. We would be the elite and no one would mess with us because we would just bend the languages in different ways and create the most crazy situations. But this also leads me back to some more thinking, okay, in a magical world, in a realm. How does this work? Because when you're saying these words, is there some mystical third force that exists there, watches over, hears what you're saying and goes, yes, I understand that phrase, therefore I'm going to implement, whatever it is that you've just commanded into existence. And what happens then if someone comes in with like a really shit accent and the magical language can't roll his R's or something? Does that magical force sit there going, yeah, he's okay? And then what happens when you get the scammers? They're like, I know all the magic. And I guess they kind of covered off a little bit in like the Harry Potter books, the magicians who really don't know what they're doing type of thing. But I do like to really just sit here and think about these things from time to time.
The idea of a grimoire, a dark book of spells. Grimoire is simply another way of spelling grammar. According to Crowley.
I don't know if that's actually true. I want to check that by check that, I'm going to check the etymology on that, because this will tell me straight up if this guy's actually researched this topic or not. Okay, so he is right. It comes from the old French grammar. Good to know.
To cast a spell is simply to spell. When we think...
Okay, for that one, I know that cast a spell does not mean to spell. It actually comes from Old English speak.
Of the fact that most of the magic gods that various cultures have created or worshipped in the past, characters like Hermes, Mercury, Thoth, these are not only the gods of magic, they are also the scribe gods. They are the gods of writing.
Now, does that mean, if you think about it, these different gods, do they all speak the same language, or do they speak different languages? And therefore, when you tap into different magical systems, does it just mean that you're more fluent in one language as opposed to another?
To some degree, the reason that I involved myself with magic was partly because, as a writer, I was feeling that something to do with the territory of writing itself.
Okay, you might be curious why I got into magic and specifically magical languages. Well, obviously I have an interest in languages overall. However, I am someone who has studied the vast majority of religions. I have studied like magical occult systems and all these types of things because I don't believe in any of it. And I would love to find something and actually be like, dear God, this works. But the more I've studied all of them, the more I've realized it's just like the creations of man overall. I'm not trying to insult anyone's religion or belief system out there. This is just my personal findings along the way. So I'm always like researching and looking into these things just because they fascinate me. One, on the possibility scale, and two, on the psychology scale. How do people come to believe in these types of things?
Way that anybody who's been writing for a given length of time will probably have anecdotes to tell you. Strange little coincidences. Things that they wrote and then something very similar happened to them. Perhaps a day, perhaps a month, perhaps 10 years later. That there are these odd little incidents that tend to build up and that you tend to shove in a filing drawer just marked weird stuff.
Yeah, what he's referring to there is basically... it's the bias. So you will write something down. You probably write down thousands of things. And then 999 of those things, will never happen. And then one of them will. And you'll have that bias where you'll be like, hang on, I actually predicted this. Oh my God. So there's something to this. This is basically what every charlatan out there relies upon, is you forgetting everything they've said except for the thing that actually substantiates their claims.
And... because you have nowhere else to put them. There is no other compartment within your life, no other context into which you can fit these strange little anomalous events, these little synchronicities. And eventually, as with myself, you might reach a point where you perhaps decide that the stuff in the drawer marked weird stuff is in fact the only important stuff, and that if you wish to progress as a writer beyond mere technique, then you might be advised to start looking at some of those events.
This actually has some interesting parallels with acting, when I was an actor. Now, I know this is not really language, but it is all part of the mind, and there is obviously connections between all of this. Now, here's the parallel, okay? So I remember when I was in my formal training after some time, our teacher said, okay, what I want you guys to do moving forward, and I still do this to this day, is whenever you're in an emotionally intense situation, let's say you're in a fight, I want you to pull out of yourself and view yourself from a third-person view, like you're in a third-person camera, and really focus in on what you're physically doing in that moment. Less so the emotion, but more the physicality of the emotion, how it's expressed. See how your leg is twitching, or maybe your eyes are like widening, or your jaw is becoming slack, or maybe it's like gritting your teeth or something like that. Maybe even like how the skin on your forehead is folding in this moment. And the reason being here is because then when you want to replicate this actually in like a monologue or something like this, you can pull on that memory and you've visualized it, and therefore you understand how you really are in this moment, and you're less going to become stereotypical in your reaction. Now, the parallel here with language is when you look at other people, you will notice similar things, especially when they speak another language. Now, I never realized this until I went to China recently, and I've actually seen it probably hundreds of times before, but never noticed it. There's like things that Chinese people will do, and this is probably something that's common across a few Asian cultures, where they'll go like this in a photo, and I didn't know what that meant, and I never even thought about it. It just never registered. It's like the elephant in the room while you're focused in on the person doing the dance in the middle. You don't see the elephant because the person in the middle's got your attention. Now, I've always seen them doing this, but I never thought about it. And then one day, it just clicked, because I was paying attention to a doctor who I was with in China, and when he was talking, and I noticed when he said he liked something, he was like this, and I was like, wait, is that like the meaning of like? Like, is that a physicality that they use when they say that they like something? And then as soon as I had recognized that, I saw it everywhere. I saw it in pictures, I saw people doing it on the street, I saw it literally everywhere. Now, this may be really stupid that I got this far in Chinese and never noticed this, but it's an interesting thing is when you pull back from yourself and the situation you're in and focus on the physicalities of the things that's happening around you, the interactions, you can get so much more about how the language is expressed. And remember, something like 70-80% of a language is actually expressed through, you know, your visual cues and movements and stuff like that.
This leads to a consideration of the relationship between fiction and reality. I started to come to the conclusion that fiction has an immaterial reality that is exactly equivalent to material reality. It is
basically, at the end of the day, it's all in our head. We're literally just a brain, you know, connected to some eyes, an ear, a mouth, and, you know, the physical sensations of our skin type of thing. So what he's saying here is that at the end of the day, it's still all just in your head.
Is no less or more real. It is simply different. For example, we have a three-dimensional solid material chair.
And you might think, okay, well, that's not really, you know, that important of a like philosophical idea or something like that yet. Yeah, okay, well, but we know it's real because, you know, in the real world, you can die. You're not going to die in your head. Now, funnily enough, I've actually read historical accounts of Aboriginals here in Australia when they felt like they were cursed. They believed the curse so much that they literally died from the belief itself.
Such as the one that I'm sitting in. This is real in material terms. Then we have the idea of a chair. The idea of a chair is perhaps more important than any single individual chair, and yet the idea of a chair exists nowhere.
This also has an interesting parallel with language overall in the fact that what is a chair? Well, basically we've got a bunch of ideas of what a chair is in our head, and we've tagged it with the word chair basically. And therefore, you're going to have like a certain amount of ideas of what a chair is based on everything you've experienced in life, but someone else might have a slightly different idea of what a chair is. And it's the semantic space of these words between native speakers is pretty much aligned, but there is some slight differences. And I remember a picture a friend sent to me. I can't find it right now because he sent it to me ages ago. Basically in the picture it had what is a burger, and then it had a bunch of pictures of what you would traditionally expect as a burger, but then it slowly morphed into things like a Subway, and then almost to some type of cake type of thing. And based on what your idea of what, you know, is a burger, you fell within a certain range, and not everyone had the same, like, basically delineating line for where a burger begins and ends. It's a very interesting idea of the semantic space.
the physical universe. It cannot be measured in a laboratory. It is completely outside the realm of science, as are all of our thoughts, all of our internal events.
I would say that's not true at all. Everything is all within the realms of science. Your brain is literally just a bunch of neurons working together to figure out things around it.
To some degree, the things that happen in our heads are the only things that we can ever know with any certainty. And yet, these are precisely the things that science is, by its very nature, completely incapable of dealing with.
And a really fascinating thing I learned about the brain recently, basically they've discovered that the brain is not just one unit, that just works together. It's basically a bunch of separate units that all have like almost their own personality. And the brain is in a constant negotiation between all these units. And it's why, maybe your emotions will override your logic at different times, because you've got different parts of your brain basically fighting for control.
Science, I think, would very often rather disprove consciousness on some basic level, would rather demonstrate that consciousness and awareness were a byproduct of, say, our biology.
And this is where it gets really interesting, and you've got artificial intelligence, and you've got these systems now that are responding to questions, talking, and they look conscious, but they're just machines. So what is the brain? Is it just another machine? I know this is like a rabbit hole, and people will go down deep into this one, and I've gone down this rabbit hole before, because are we just a really complex computer that is aware of itself? But you can even train a large language model to be aware of itself in some ways. And you've got a lot of crazy claims from some really high level AI developers where they're even saying that they believe some of these large language models are actually self-aware. Whether that's hyperbolic or not, it's very interesting.
Because then they would not have to deal with the problem of what Kerstler and others referred to as the ghost in the machine. Consciousness is a ghost, a spook, a phantom that somehow spoils the logic of this perfectly balanced clockwork universe.
I've actually used this concept to help me a lot in life. So every now and then I'll let my physical, desires to just randomly do whatever I want, get fat, lazy, lay around, do nothing. I just let my desires basically rule me. But if I sit there and go, you know what? I'm literally just a brain riding in a meat body, then for some strange reason, I don't know why, but the idea that I'm a brain inside this body and I can tell the body what I want, and then I somehow get more control of these things. I don't know what it is about that thought, but it makes me feel more disconnected from my body, and therefore I can have more control over it. This video is going super philosophical. I did not expect this when I started.
Worldview that we have created for ourselves. Now, to me, if you're going to try and come up with a new way of talking about consciousness, then that is precisely what you need to do. You have to come up with a new way of looking at the basic phenomena. It will not be scientific. It cannot be scientific.
I don't understand what he means by that.
But for me, what it came down to was understanding the world inside our heads, the world of consciousness, as a world, as a space, as a kind of space that had its own rules, had its own unique properties, and was just as demonstrably real as the three-dimensional physical space which was.
One interesting thing about this I have thought about with languages and in my own mind. So I imagine as I grow within a language, it's almost like when I start out with a language, I step into an empty room and there's nothing in this room. And as I start to learn, the different basics of the language and certain words, it's like I start filling up the room, and then there becomes adjacent rooms, and then I can step between these rooms. And when I compare it to my English brain, which is like a sprawling city of knowledge within this language, and it's all interconnected, a new language to me is basically just a room that slowly starts to spread out. And there may be times where I'll jump in an elevator and I'll end up in a totally different section of this language where I've never explored anything before. And then I'll start forming these almost, as they say, language islands of knowledge. And eventually, they'll start to overcross and connect with one another.
We inhabit. Starting to consider the nature of that space tends to lead you to consider previous attempts to define consciousness in spatial terms.
I've never really struggled with this concept of consciousness. It seems like right now he's really thought about consciousness. To me, consciousness is basically just the outcome of a very complex system in which it's able to respond to everything around it. And if it's able to respond to everything around it, eventually it's going to be able to respond to itself. And that's all consciousness is. It's just a very complex system that is aware of itself. Now, I know, in a scientific sense, it's way more complex than that, and we don't really have all the information on it. But for me, that seems to answer the question enough. And again, I know this channel's devoted to languages and stuff, but every now and then I like to go down these rabbit holes.
You could think of Plato with his world of ideal forms. Something that exists nowhere in physical reality, but which, according to Plato, must exist, must precede physical reality.
There's actually a really interesting constructed language which is based on the idea of like categorization according to a certain system. I forget the name of the constructed language, but I guarantee someone will drop it down in the comments below. But basically someone, and this is actually a really old constructed language, it predates Esperanto by quite a bit. And basically the idea was that we're going to start categorizing everything into a perfect system. So this was before we had even an idea of, evolution, basically. So they categorized, animals based on whether they had 4 feet, 2 feet, and then the word would go, so you have a word for that. So you have a word for an animal that's got 4 feet, or a word that's an animal that's got 2 feet. And then they'd change one aspect of this word, so a vowel or something, to symbolize whether it's got paw-based feet or whether it's got hoof feet. And they kept going down and down and down. And it was really fascinating because they created a whole language around this tree of hierarchy, basically. But it's a terrible language because any animal that is very similar to another animal is going to sound almost exactly like that other animal because there'll be literally one vowel difference or one consonant difference. It's a terrible system overall because you're going to confuse everything. But it was fascinating to see that categorization was basically the first attempt at a constructed language.
Must be this world of essences that all material form is merely a kind of distant echo of. There are other ideas. There is Carl Jung's idea of a mass unconscious. This again is a sort of a place somewhere within our ancestral memory. There is Karl Popper, who talked of World 3. World 3 is a kind of hypothetical abstract space in which immaterial human constructions, ideologies, for example, Marxism. These are constructs that do not actually have a material form, but are nonetheless important and often sizable mechanisms in the world of ideas.
So I'm guessing here he's just talking about, for example, with Esperanto, it had the original core ideal, and by learning the language, you become acquainted with that ideal in some way, and you may even basically be impacted upon it. And these types of things can spread, basically. There is ideas that will spread almost in a hive mind-like matter.
To me, the world inside our heads, I gave it the working label of idea space. I believe that it can be treated as a space. And that, yes, just as we each have our own private address in physical space, just as we have our own private house or flat or room, then so too do we have our own private area of consciousness. This is the area that we generally label as ourself. However, if you go outside your flat,
I get the feeling he's talking maybe something like astral recall right now, which is where you basically, there's an idea that you can eject your own soul or your own mind from your actual physical form and then travel to another location and stuff. I know a lot of stuff about this because I know Wiccans and stuff, including my dad, who's one, and they talk about this type of stuff all the time. I think most of it's bullshit, basically. It's basically just you get really good at visualization. Now, there is one interesting thing here where you can use this type of visualization of space for language learning. That's the memory palace. If you guys have not looked into a memory palace, it's actually a really cool concept and a really interesting way to memorize very large monologues in a very quick time. And I've actually used it when helping, there was like a Chinese businesswoman who wanted to sell properties, and she needed to have like this big speech that she was going to give to all these like, what was it? It was like, it wasn't investors, but it was basically the owners of these different building companies. And I helped her literally in one night memorize like a 3-page monologue in English, and English is not her native language, using a memory palace. And we spent hours walking around her house, tagging out the entire thing. And by the end of it, she actually got it. It was really good.
Or house or room, then you'll find that the area beyond its walls is communal. I think this may also be true.
Yeah, he's definitely talking about stuff like astral recall here, where there's an idea with it that you can step out of your mind and touch someone else's and even inflict pain upon them and stuff, but you've got to be careful because, you know, while you're outside your mind, you're basically exposed to others. It's a kind of a crazy concept.
Of the kind of conceptual space that I'm talking about. That if you wander out the back door of your mind and personality, wander down its back alleyways, you might find yourself in a deeper area of that mental space than the...
Now, although I said that's kind of a crazy idea, I have heard from family members really interesting things where, for example, when my grandmother passed away, she was in hospital. When she passed away, my mum was like in another city. My mum woke up to it at the exact same time. It was like there was some type of, I'm not going to say energy, but there was some type of connection that basically was severed in that moment. And it pulled her awake. And she knew at that moment that our grandma had passed away. So it's like, there's something there.
The one that you are usually accustomed to. You might find that there are different rules which seem to apply in these deeper areas of consciousness. You might find that there are people, creatures, things living there, flora and fauna.
Yeah, now he's starting to go down off the dark end, basically. Like, all of this is like a load of crap in my eyes.
And to some degree, this is central to all my ideas of magic. And by magic, I mean basically what everybody means by magic. I mean a rabbit out of a hat. I mean something emerging demonstrably from nothing. So to a certain degree, in that I would include our physical universe emerging from a single...
I think magic is just a byproduct of us not knowing enough around the world, and therefore we just say, well, this happened in this instance due to the fact that we have no way of explaining it. And realistically, it reminds me of the saying that, you know, as we progress scientifically and we gain more knowledge about the world around us, the role that God plays in people's lives shrinks and shrinks, and it basically becomes God of the gaps. And this is the same thing with magic. It's basically magic of the gaps. We just don't have the knowledge there. Therefore, that's where God exists. That's where magic exists. Now, again, I'm not trying to offend anyone on this. This is just kind of my take on things. But for me, realistically, the most interesting thing here, and something people never talk about, is if magic is just language, like your spell casting and stuff like that, then what happens with time as your spell casting evolves? How does that impact upon magical systems? What happens as accents develop in a magical language? You know, if you have an accent developing, is there, again, some third-party spiritual entity that's watching over, and it also learns from this? And, you know, this sent me down like some crazy rabbit holes, because I was thinking, let's say you had someone who has survived for an eternity, okay? They were born when Jesus died type of thing, which meant at that time they probably spoke Aramaic type of thing. But then as the world evolved around them and kept going and the languages changed and evolved, would their language change with it? as well? Or would they remain speaking that original language, or would they still speak and think in that original language, or would their languages change in over time? And would they, just like everyone else over a millennium, forget their original language? Because there is people, and I've spoken with them in the Discord, where they've forgotten their native languages, or they put them aside because they don't use them much anymore. Which then leads me to like the next set of thoughts is, would it be possible to maintain all those languages over a millennium, or would it just be too much for the human brain to basically hold? Like, you existed for a millennium, therefore you've probably spoken, 100 languages in this time because you've existed for so long. Would it be possible to maintain all those languages? Because obviously you'd need to practice them every day, but because you spoke them for such large periods, would you actually lose them? I'm assuming you would probably lose the vast majority of them. But then again, you would probably hold on to some really weird, like, internal logic of your original language.
Single point in a quantum vacuum, I would include any human thought or idea or work of art which demonstrably starts out nowhere.
This is making me now think about an Egyptian experiment. This actually happened in ancient Egypt. It was fascinating. I read a tiny little bit about it. And basically, the pharaoh wanted to know what the language of the gods was, because they wanted to know basically how the gods spoke, And how can you figure out what the language of the gods was? Well, there was a belief that when you were born, you actually thought and spoke the god's language. And then after that, you were impacted by humanity. As you started growing up, you adopted the language of humans and you forgot the godly language. And this pharaoh thought, I'm going to do an experiment to find out what the godly language is. And he took some poor child, and he gave him to a farmer. And he basically said, no human is allowed to speak or interact with this child beyond just giving them food. Now, this child obviously is going to be very stunted because he has no verbal interactions from the people around him. However, because he was with a farmer, he was with the animals, he actually started mimicking the animal sounds. Now, I don't know whether the pharaoh later decided that, so the gods just spoke animal sounds, but it's an interesting idea is that, can you think before you have language, or is language actually your thinking? Because when I go into my head and I think about things, I think about them in English. And then when I'm speaking Esperanto, I'll think about them in Esperanto. So prior to having a language, what do you think in?
Starts out in the silence of our minds. First there is no idea. Then there is the flickering of an idea. Then there is a fully realised idea. And then finally we have a physical artifact which we can hold in our hands. We have a book, we have a painting. This to me is a magical act. Any act of creation.
I guess to me, a parallel here would be, speaking a language in a way is almost like a magical act if you're using his thinking, because you start with nothing, then you basically absorb this language from the world around you and you start using it. And then later on, you actually create your own artworks based on this language that you've learnt from the world around you, when originally you had nothing. Now, I'm sure science has probably covered this off. There's probably people in the comments section who know so much more about this. And I'm always curious to hear and learn from others, what they've found in their random discoveries and, research and stuff, because I'm sure I'm not the only person who has probably gone down these dark holes.
Is a magical act, which is probably why I tend to express most of my magical thinking in terms of creative acts. If I can turn it into a piece of writing or a set of images or a performance so that other people can share the information concerning that realm.
So basically, in summary, for him, magic is just the creation of something new. And by the sounds of it, creation of something that's artistically new and uses language in some way or another.
Then, to me, that is part of what a magician's job is.
So overall, we didn't actually learn anything about languages from this, but it did allow me to explore on some of these ideas which I've had in the past. As I said, today's my birthday. I didn't want to do anything too serious. Let me guys know what you think about this video in the comments. I'm not sure if I'll be going down these types of paths again, but if you like this stuff, let me know type of thing, because there is interesting parallels between all of these things that look on the surface completely separate. Magic, language, you know, programming, machines, all of these things in some way are like interlinked, and you can find a connection between all of them, and you can just end up going in this weird circle around and around, chasing your tail, trying to figure this stuff out. That's pretty much it. If you guys like this video, let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you all in the next video. And if you're not there, then my very next creation may be the destruction of your body.